right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another week of webinars here at Route Consultant. As you all know, this particular webinar focuses on the waste industry. I'm Leah Nelson, and I'm part of the education team here at Route Consultant. I usually focus on the financial and analysis aspects of different businesses and different industries. So today, we're going to all come together and learn more about the waste industry and answer any questions that you all have got. If you've never joined us for a webinar before, we do follow a certain format. So first, we're going to cover the content of the week, and then at the end, we'll leave time for a Q&A session if anyone has any outstanding questions. Those questions can be pertaining to today's topic, or they can be pertaining really to anything in the waste industry. We just want to answer any questions that you've got. If you're watching this on YouTube later on, and you have some questions, feel free to reach out to us at info@routeconsultant.com. We're happy to help you out, or you can join us for a live webinar next week. We do them at the same day and time every week. So speaking of questions, if you do have a question at any point during the webinar today, make sure you are dropping those in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. If you put them in the chat, I probably won't see them, unfortunately, so they may not get answered. But if you put them in the Q&A section, we will be able to answer those questions. So if you have joined us before, you know that Tommy is our resident expert in the waste industry. If it's your first time with us, Tommy has worked in the waste industry for decades and has invaluable experience in the field. If you want more information on Tommy and his background, feel free to visit our other webinars on Route Consultant's YouTube page. So all the information's there, tons of information about the waste industry as a whole. But so we're gonna go ahead and just jump into it. Today, we're going to be chatting about waste containers and maintenance. I see Tommy's hopped on here. Hello.
Hey, Leah, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Good.
Perfect. Well, we're just going to go ahead and jump right in. Like I said, waste containers and maintenance today. So, when we say the term container, that's a pretty broad term. So, what are the primary categories of containers?
Well, containers are really based on the three different primary lines of business that are in the waste business. So there's residential, commercial, and then the industrial construction side. So in residential, containers are primarily referred to as carts. And so are the big plastic carts. They do come in various sizes. Most of them that are used, if you're providing them, are 90-gallon carts. They're made out of plastic, and there are many different manufacturers and looks to these, but that's primarily from a container standpoint. In residential, it's a cart. And then when you get into the commercial, it really depends on the type of trucks that you use. The majority of folks use front end loaders, and they typically come in four standard sizes: 2 cubic yard, 4 yard, 6 yard, and 8 yard. But then if you happen to have some rear loader containers that you may mix in, if you're in a rural market, those have other sizes. Again, primarily they'll throw in some 1 and 3 yards, and then also side loaders. And then when you get into the industrial construction, you basically have two different types of containers. There are open top containers, which are the ones that are primarily used at construction sites. And you'll also see them in some industrial sites. And then there's compactors as well. And so the roll-off containers, the most common are 20, 30, and 40 cubic yard, but there are some 10 and 15 if you're using smaller trucks to enter that market.
Perfect. Yeah, and you mentioned containers, or not, excuse me, compactors. A lot of C terms here. We mentioned compactors. So, are there different types of compactors? Can you tell us a little bit more about those?
Yeah, there are many different types of compactors. The most common are in the industrial and construction side, or in the roll-off business. There are some that are in the commercial side, and they're typically in 6 and 8 yard is where they're at. But they're not very common, but they are out there. Mm-hmm. But when you get into the industrial side, you have basically self-contained compactors and stationary compactors for the most part. And so stationary means the compactor itself is bolted into the ground, and then there is a container that's totally enclosed that hooks up to the container with ratchets. And so when you go to empty that, you unhook the container and just take the container. And then there are self-contained, where the compactor portion and the container are all in one piece. And so those are the ones that primarily have some liquid involved in them, and they have a seal around the back door to make sure nothing leaks out of the compactor.
Are any of those compactors, I mean, of course, they have different uses. Are any of them, I quote unquote better than others, or like just more common, or does it just kind of depend on your needs?
Well, it really depends on the customer. So where you're going to see the self-contained compactors are going to be at large apartment complexes, large grocery stores, because they will have things that either decompose or dispose of some liquids, and so you want to make sure that's contained. And then the stationary compactors are going to be at manufacturing facilities, industrial sites, big box retailers, a lot of those where they don't have liquid or don't have grocery store, as part of the big box retailer. So it really depends on the type of customer. That will depend on the type of compactor when they get to that needing something of that capacity.
That makes sense. That definitely makes sense. So, how, excuse me, how long do containers and compactors typically last when you purchase them?
Well, the easy answer is it depends. Uh,
Fair.
but I would say, on commercial containers, a good rule of thumb is 7 years. Um, and so, some will last much longer, some will last less. Some of that depends on where you're located. If you're located in a coastal town, the salt is going to rust out the containers more often. And then the other is the type of waste that gets thrown in. Some, there's more acidity in the waste and it will rust out containers quicker, but there are other options you can do. Um, and then in the roll off, again, it typically 7 to 10 years is a good rule of thumb, but compactors, I know we're going to talk about maintenance. It really depends on your maintenance. I've had compactors, stationary compactors that I've had out for over 20 years, that have been on site for over 20 years.
That's definitely definitely a long time. So yeah, we mentioned maintenance, so we'll kind of hop into that. What are some of the most common ways that containers break and need repairs? Like, what does that look like from a maintenance perspective?
Yeah, so on the residential side, it's primarily the lid. I mean, that's what would happen. The lid gets bent or busted, but they're also pretty pliable as well. So not necessarily that common, but that would be the biggest item there. And then on the commercial side, again, it's the lids as well.
Mhm.
And it really depends whether the type of lids you have. There are metal lids, there are plastic lids. The plastic lids are much more common, uh, just because, again, they're pliable. And if they hit up against something, there's a good chance they'll come back. And then also the side doors. When you get into the 6 and 8 yard containers that have the side doors, those are the things that are most common as far as the general maintenance type repairs that you're going to have. And then when you get into the industrial and construction side, on the open tops, it's primarily the rear doors. Those are heavy, they have hinges on them, and and those things, they're swung open, and sometimes on construction sites they may get abused. There's a lot of heavy equipment out there, and they decide they're going to move your container for in a space that they need it. And so that happens. They can spring the doors, but then are totally different. You still have the doors on the containers you have to deal with, but then you have the electronic components, the hydraulic components that you have to deal with if you choose to get into the compactor business.
That makes sense. If so, you mentioned customers could move them, break them, lids fall off, springs come undone. Who is responsible if the customer breaks one of your containers?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends. If it's routine maintenance, when you start talking about, on commercial side, the lids and the doors, for the most part, you're going to take care of those. But if you get into, damage to the container, a whole lot of that depends on what you have in your agreement. And we can spend a whole lot of time talking about that, but it's important in your agreements on these containers that you have that responsibility lined out, because it's on their property. I mean, commercial container, you're going to handle it about 4 minutes. I mean, it's going to be about 3 or 4 minutes on the service side. And so all the other time it's there. So if it gets hit by a car, if it gets burnt, those types of things, you need to make sure that's addressed. And then on the commercial and industrial side, the same issue, really the majority of the damage there is going to come from them trying to move the container themselves with heavy equipment. And so you just need to make sure that's covered in your agreement. You're responsible for the general maintenance, and when you're handling it, but outside of that, they're responsible.
Perfect. Yeah, definitely have thorough agreements. That's, obviously best in any industry, but for things like this, of course. So assume a container does break. Where do you go to get that fixed?
Well, I would tell you, if you have to make a decision when you get into the business, at how much are you going to do independently? And I would tell you, if you're going to get into, especially any of them, residential, commercial. If residential, you're offering the cards commercial, or in the industrial side, you need to be prepared to do some level of maintenance. And whether that is, just replacing lids, swapping them out, and some of these you can do on site, but most of it you're going to bring it in and do the repairs. But then when you start getting into major repairs, which some of them have, so you get and you look at and determining whether you're going to replace the bottom of a container that's rusted out. That's one of those things you have to weigh: the cost of a container versus the cost of repair. How much is it gonna extend the life? And those, I would tell you that, until you get a good volume of those, you probably need to try to find somewhere. It can be a machine shop, metal shop, or even some of the container manufacturers will take them back in and redo that for you. But that's a major undertaking when you go to do that, and it's a matter of, okay, do I buy the bottoms that will automatically fit where I weld? And then it depends on the variety of the manufacturers that you use, as well as even doing that. But I would tell you, at an absolute minimum, you need to make sure that you have a pressure washer, because these containers do get nasty. And you need to have some type of welder to do little spot welding and things of that sort, even early on in the process, to be able to make these types of repairs.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Welders. I was thinking, I was like, you obviously have auto repair shops and things like that. So I'm like, is there container repair shops? So perfect. Well, can you rent containers? Say you run out of containers, or you hit your capacity, you have a couple clients coming on or what have you. Can you rent containers for a temporary period of time, or do you always have to buy them?
You always have to buy them. There's unless you're going to rent them from a competitor, which again, they would probably do that. It would be quite expensive. But again, so a whole lot of times that's what your business is. You're providing that container, and there's no places that I'm aware of that say, hey, I'll rent you this container for 3 months for you to go out and service and take care of.
Yeah.
So you do have to find places to buy your containers at.
Speaking of buying them, where are places that you buy containers?
There are a lot of waste container manufacturers. They are scattered all across the country. And so, there are manufacturers, there are distributors. And so I would, you can go on and you can Google search and find those that are close, but there are some that are the more dominant, and many of them will have multiple manufacturing facilities across the country. But they'll also tend to be a little regional. I mean, some of them are very much regional. You don't want to find a manufacturer in Florida if you're servicing in California, right? So because the cost of those transportation is not included. And so so when you purchase, you want to make sure you're buying truckload quantities. Uh, however however many they can fit on the large flatbed, and it really depends on the size. But you can also mix and match. Hey, I need this many of this many of this size until you fill up the entire truck. But it is finding that right manufacturer for your needs.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I was wondering about transportation as well. So you answered that's not included. So definitely maximize your order there to get the most out of that transportation cost. As you're buying containers, how many spare containers, should you have on hand?
Well, when you look at the residential and commercial, it's really what's happening with your growth rate. In the residential, your carts are probably going to be consistent in size, and it depends on how aggressive you are on your growth and what's going on. When you get into the commercial, it really depends on the size and how you're growing. But you will need to have a good variety of the different types of containers, because what a small service company may need versus a fast food restaurant, and the sizes are very different. And so you can get by for a period of time if you put a larger container out there until a smaller one comes in, but you can't do the reverse. You can't put a 2-yard container where somebody needs a 6-yard. So I would tell you, you always need to have some of every size on site when it comes to commercial. But it really depends on your growth rate. And starting off, it's tough to make that determination. What's the right number? How fast are you growing? To understand that. On the industrial and construction side, you have to be aware of what size containers you're going to use mostly. Um, I would tell folks you need to be careful with 40-yard, the largest of the open top containers out on construction sites, because you don't know how they're going to load it. Again, they're loading it, and you have to be aware of the weight distribution. But in the spring, summer, and early fall, in most locations, construction picks up. And so with that, you have to make sure you have sufficient amount for the construction that's going to pick up the business you're going to get. But then what that means is in the cold months, when construction slows down, you've got to have a location to store those containers, because you're just not going to have as many.
Right.
And so the seasonality in the waste business is primarily just in the construction side of the business, because your your industrial, your large apartment complexes, I mean, those are going to be consistent. Your manufacturing facilities, those are going to be consistent throughout the entire year. And it's really the seasonality is in the construction side. And so, it may be, hey, this is what I'm able to invest. I'll get this many containers, and you just use those up and say, hey, I'll put you on the list when another one comes in. I mean, that is a possibility. Yeah. Because everybody hates telling people no, but if you get overstocked in open top containers, then you've got to make sure those, depending on where you're at geographically, those 3 to 5 months when the construction industry slows, you're not getting any revenue out of those containers.
Yeah, seasonality definitely for that, having some extra, spots to put those. So perfect. Well, are there any other, main things to consider with containers? Any other, tips, tricks, any other information that we need to know about containers?
Well, I would say, you need to think through, especially if you're getting into the commercial or the industrial construction side of the business, you need to think through what your container strategy is, because you need to have them. It is a huge investment. I mean, when you start talking about you have several hundred customers or several hundred containers, these things aren't cheap. But I would tell you, you need to find 2 to 4 good options of where you can buy these containers. And you need to make sure you're checking out the quality, get references, talk to people as you're looking at those. You need to understand the type of material that they're putting in, the gauge steel, those types of things. And then the other you have to determine is the transportation cost. I mean, that is a big deal when you're doing that. And the third is what's their availability. You know,
Mhm.
you ask, hey, what does your inventory need to be? You need to kind of find out, okay, what kind of inventory do they keep on hand? And what's the availability? How often can they turn those around? And that's why I would tell you to get 2 to 4, because it could be somebody else in a not even in your market or even close to your market. Something happened, they ordered a lot of containers and could have depleted you know their inventory, and then you need some, and they're out. So you need to be able to go somewhere else, and it's better to have a couple of places set up on the front end. um, the other thing is you have to determine how you're going to do the maintenance,
Yeah.
um, to what extent you're going to do internally. And then in those situations, you need to have something set up on the front end for, if you're new in the business and you're starting up getting in that, you're not going to have issues with the bottoms of containers rusting out for a period of time. But if you buy an existing business, you're going to have that issue right off the bat.
Yeah.
So how do you do that? How do you deal with that? And then when it comes to compactors, you you almost have to have somebody that's able to do compactor repair. And that's a pretty diverse individual. They need to understand hydraulics. They need to understand electrical, and go out, and go on site and be able to do that. Or you have to have be able to have a contractor that's able to do that. But you need to understand that's going to be when they're available. And some of the distributors have those people that are scattered out in the geographic area they work in. So but those are the two big things, as it comes to containers. Make sure you're prepared for your purchases. Don't rely solely on one vendor. Make sure you have a backup, or maybe 2 to 3 backups based on what you're doing. And then the other is look at your maintenance, because if you go to do a full container maintenance program, uh, you have to, I mean, it takes a lot to get those set up, as far as lifts to move containers, the ability, how are you going to paint them? Because containers are reused, especially in the commercial side, you reuse those containers.
Yeah.
And so you can't take one that you pick up from a fast food restaurant and just take it somewhere. I mean, that's not going to go over very well. Um, but there's a huge investment when you get to that point of doing that, with all the things you have to do related to painting and the maintenance and the inventory of the steel to fix things. So um, that those are just things that you need to have a plan for on the front end, because most people think of the capital that you need related to trucks and things, that in the maintenance of trucks. But then in the waste space, you also have to take care of the containers, or it can have a adverse effect on your P&L, if you don't have a good maintenance program involved in that, because you can't just go out every time something goes wrong with a container, buy a new one.
Right. Yeah, definitely having that. Except people, you're right. People think about trucks all the time, the cost of trucks, the CapEx costs, the maintenance costs, but definitely thinking about those containers is really, really important. It's a big investment in the waste industry. So you want to make sure that all your ducks in a row and everything's planned out. So that's really all the questions that I had. Let's see if we've got any Q&A questions really quickly. It looks like we don't, which is A-okay. But if anybody on the webinar right now does have any questions they think of later, or anybody watching on the YouTube page, feel free to reach out to us again at info@routeconsultant.com. Again, it can be about containers or compactors or maintenance, or it can really be about anything in the waste industry as a whole. We are absolutely happy to help with that. Also, if you are interested in learning more about the waste space, we do have our 101 course online. It is absolutely free. So you can sign up for that and learn some more about the waste industry. And then we've got our summit online as well, if you're interested in pursuing that. So if you watch the 101 and you say, hey, I really want to learn more about this, You can sign up for our summit, which also does come with an in-person workshop at our Nashville, Tennessee office. So you can meet the team and you can meet Tommy and really, just get all of your questions answered. And then we're going to have our master class, which is really the next step, coming up soon as well. So again, if you have any questions, if you're interested in any products or consulting or any of those things, feel free to reach out to us and we are happy to help. And that's what we've got today. So we'll wrap up.